I buried my wife on a Thursday. On Saturday, I drove to her grave to sit with her, the way I had promised I always would. And while I was gone, my daughter-in-law changed every lock on the house I built with my own hands. She thought she had won. Then, 3 days later, my phone rang. It was my lawyer. And the first thing he said was, "Sir, you own the deed. Before I tell you everything, do me one small favor. If you believe that patience and quiet dignity can outlast the greediest people in our lives, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is where you are right now." I read every single one. Now let me take you back to the beginning, because to understand what happened at that house, you first have to understand what that house was, and what it cost me to build it. My name is Harold Whitaker. I am 71 years old. And for most of my life, I was a carpenter, a builder, a man who worked with his hands and took pride in things that were made to last. I never had much money. I never wanted much money. What I wanted was to build a good life with a good woman, and for 46 years, I had exactly that. Her name was Eleanor. I met her in the summer of 1973, at a church social in a small town in Ohio, where everybody knew everybody, and I was too shy to say a word to her. She was the one who walked up to me. She was always braver than me, in every way that mattered. She held out her hand and she said, "You are the boy who fixed the pastor's porch, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am." And she said, "Well, it does not creak anymore, so I suppose you must be good with your hands." That was it. That was the whole beginning of 46 years. We married the following spring in that same little church with barely 20 people in the pews and a borrowed suit that was one size too big for me. We had nothing. We rented a single room above a laundromat, and in the summer, the heat from the machines below made it feel like living inside an oven. But we were happy. God, we were happy. I would come home from the job site covered in sawdust, and Eleanor would be waiting with dinner she had stretched out of almost nothing, and we would sit by the open window and talk about the house we would build one day. That was our dream. Not a fancy car, not a big vacation. A house, our own house, built by my own hands on a piece of land that belonged to us and no one else. It took us 11 years to save enough to buy the land. 11 years of pinching every penny, of me taking every extra job I could find, of Eleanor sewing clothes for neighbors and selling pies at the county fair. Let me tell you what those 11 years were really like, because I think young people today do not understand this kind of patience anymore. We kept a coffee can on top of the refrigerator, and every week, no matter how tight things were, we put something in it. Some weeks it was $10, some weeks it was 50 cents. There were weeks when we took money out because the car broke down or the rent went up, and we would sit at the kitchen table and count what was left and feel like we would never get there. But Eleanor never lost faith. She had a way of making a hard life feel like an adventure. On the nights when I was most discouraged, when I felt like a failure for not being able to give her more, she would take my rough, calloused hands in hers, and she would say, "Harold, I did not marry you for a big house. I married you for those hands, and for the heart that runs them. The house will come." And it did come. Every dollar in that coffee can was a dollar we earned together, and when we finally counted enough to buy that half-acre lot, we felt like the richest people in the world. And when we finally bought that half-acre lot on the edge of town, we stood in the middle of the empty field, and Eleanor cried, and I held her, and I promised her I would build her the finest house those hands could make, and I did. I built that house myself, board by board, over the better part of 2 years, working on it in the evenings and on weekends after my paying jobs were done. I want you to understand what that means. After a full day of building houses for other people, I would drive to our little lot, and I would work on our house until it was too dark to see. Eleanor would come out in the evenings with sandwiches and a thermos of coffee, and she would sit on a stack of lumber and keep me company while I worked, holding a lantern so I could see to drive one more nail before we went home to the room above the laundromat. On the weekends, we would be out there from sunrise to sunset. Eleanor learned to hand me the right tools. She learned to hold a board steady while I sawed. She got splinters in her hands and sunburn on her neck, and she never once complained, because this was our dream and we were building it together. I laid the foundation myself. I framed every wall. I hung every door, set every window, shingled the whole roof in the blazing August sun. There is a spot on the back corner of that roof where I nearly fell, one hot afternoon, and Eleanor screamed, and I caught myself on the edge, and afterward we both sat on the grass shaking, and then we laughed until we cried, because we were young and in love and building something out of nothing. Eleanor picked out the paint colors and the kitchen tiles, and she planted a garden in the backyard before the house even had a finished floor. It was not a mansion. It was a modest two-story house with a front porch and 3 bedrooms and a kitchen big enough to gather in. But it was ours. Every nail in it was ours, and when we finally moved in, on a cold December night in 1986, we sat on the floor of the empty living room, with a single lamp and a thermos of coffee, and Eleanor looked around at those walls I had built, and she said, "Harold, we are home. We are finally home." I have thought about that moment 10,000 times since. We raised our son in that house. His name is Daniel, and he was born 2 years after we moved in the spring of 1988. I remember bringing him home from the hospital, this tiny thing wrapped in a blue blanket, and carrying him through the front door I had hung with my own hands, and thinking that my whole life had led to this. A house I built, a wife I adored, and now a son to fill those rooms with noise and life. For a long time, that is exactly what we had. Daniel grew up in that house, measured his height on the kitchen doorframe every year, learned to ride a bike in the driveway, carved his initials into the big maple tree out back when he was 9, and I pretended to be angry about it, but secretly, I loved that he had left his mark. We were not rich, but we were rich in the ways that count. Eleanor filled that house with warmth. She was the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday, who brought soup to sick neighbors, who never let a person leave our home hungry. And I worked, and I built, and I provided, and every night I came home to a lit window and the smell of her cooking, and I thought I was the luckiest man alive. I was. I just did not know how quickly luck can turn. Because the boy we raised in that house, the boy who carved his initials in the maple tree, grew into a man I did not always recognize. And the woman he married would one day stand on my porch and tell me I no longer had a home. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about Daniel, and about how the cracks began to show, long before Eleanor ever got sick. Daniel was a good boy. I want to say that clearly, because what came later does not erase what came before. As a child, he was gentle and curious, always following me around the workshop, asking what every tool was for. I taught him how to use a hammer when he was 5. I taught him how to measure twice and cut once. I thought, for a long time, that he would take up the trade after me, that one day the sign on my truck would read Whitaker & Son. But somewhere in his teenage years, Daniel started to want a different kind of life. He was ashamed of the old truck. He was ashamed of the modest house. He would come home from visiting wealthier friends and look at our life with a kind of quiet disappointment that broke my heart a little every time. Eleanor always defended him. She would say, "He is young, Harold. He does not understand yet what matters. He will learn," and I believed her, because she was usually right about people. Daniel was smart, smarter than me by a mile when it came to books, and he got himself into a good college on a partial scholarship. We were proud of him. I remember the day the acceptance letter came. Eleanor cried, and I stood a little taller, and we took Daniel out to the nicest restaurant we could afford, which was not very nice, but it was a celebration and it was ours. We paid what we could, took out a small loan for the rest, and Eleanor sold her mother's jewelry, the only truly valuable thing she owned, to help cover his final year. I need you to understand what that jewelry meant to her. It was all she had left of her own mother, who had died when Eleanor was young. A necklace, a ring, and a pair of earrings that had been passed down for 3 generations. Eleanor used to take them out sometimes on quiet evenings and hold them and tell me stories about her mother. They were the most precious things she owned. And when Daniel's final year of college came, and we did not have the money, Eleanor took those heirlooms to a jeweler in the city, without telling me first, and she sold them, all of them, so that our son could finish his education. When she told me what she had done, I was heartbroken, and I said, "Eleanor, those were your mother's." And she said, "Harold, my mother would have done the same for me. That is what these things are for, not to sit in a drawer, to be given, in love, when they are needed." She never told Daniel that. She made me promise never to tell him that. She did not want him to feel guilty, she said. She wanted him to have his chance. Daniel went off into the world of business, got a job at a firm in the city, started wearing suits and driving a car that cost more than I made in a year. And slowly, the distance grew. He called less. He visited less. When he did come home, he seemed impatient, checking his watch, taking calls in the other room. Eleanor would cook his favorite meal, and he would eat quickly and leave early. And after he was gone, she would sit at the kitchen table, and I could see the quiet ache in her, though she never once complained. Then Daniel met Sabrina. I remember the first time he brought her to the house. She stepped out of his expensive car, looked up at the home I had built with my own 2 hands, and I watched her face do a little calculation, a small tightening around the eyes, as if she were adding up its worth and finding it disappointing. She was polite enough on the surface. She smiled. She shook our hands. She called Eleanor Mrs. Whitaker in a voice as smooth as glass. But Eleanor felt it right away. That night, after they left, Eleanor said something to me that I have never forgotten. She said, "Harold, that young woman does not see us as people. She sees us as an inheritance." I told her she was being unfair, that we had only just met the girl. But Eleanor just shook her head slowly and said, "A mother knows. Watch how she looks at the house, Harold. She does not look at it like a home. She looks at it like a price tag. And God help me." Eleanor was right. She was always right about people. Daniel and Sabrina married 2 years later, in a lavish ceremony that cost more than my truck, my tools, and probably my house combined. We sat in the second row, not the first, a small slight that Sabrina arranged and pretended was an accident. Eleanor wore the nicest dress she owned and held my hand through the whole thing, and afterward she said it was beautiful, and she meant it, because she was incapable of bitterness. But I saw the way Sabrina's family looked at us, the carpenter and his wife, the poor relations, the people to be tolerated, and I saw the way my own son let them look at us that way, without ever once standing up to say, "These are my parents, and they gave me everything." That was the first real crack. Not a fight, not a betrayal, just a son who was slowly becoming ashamed of where he came from, and a daughter-in-law who saw an old house and 2 aging people as an obstacle between her and something she wanted. For a few years, life settled into a quiet, distant rhythm. Daniel and Sabrina lived in the city. We saw them on holidays, sometimes, when it was convenient for them. Eleanor and I grew older together in the house we loved, tending the garden, fixing what needed fixing, growing closer with each passing year, as the world got smaller, and it became mostly just the 2 of us again, the way it had been at the very beginning. And I will tell you, those years were good. Even with the distance from our son, even with the ache of it, Eleanor and I had a kind of peace that most people never find. We would sit on the porch in the evenings and watch the sun go down behind the maple tree, with Daniel's initials still carved in it. We would take slow walks around the neighborhood, holding hands like teenagers. We had our routines, our little jokes, our 46 years of shared history that no amount of distance could erase. I thought we would grow very old together in that house. I thought we had all the time in the world. And then, in the autumn of her 68th year, Eleanor started getting tired. At first we thought it was nothing. A woman in her late 60s gets tired. That is normal. But the tiredness deepened into something else, a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of rest could fix. And then came the weight loss, and the pain she tried to hide from me. Eleanor was never one to complain, and she was never one to worry me if she could help it. So by the time she finally let me take her to the doctor, the thing growing inside her had already spread further than anyone wanted to say out loud. I remember sitting in that cold office, holding her hand, while a doctor half our age used careful words to tell us that my wife was dying. Eleanor squeezed my hand. She was comforting me, in that moment, when it should have been the other way around. That was the kind of woman she was. We did everything the doctors suggested. The treatments, the appointments, the long drives to the hospital in the city. I learned more about medicine in those months than I ever wanted to know. I learned how to keep track of a dozen pills. I learned how to help her when she was too weak to stand. I learned how to hold her hair back when the treatments made her sick, and how to change the sheets in the middle of the night without waking her, and how to smile and tell her she was still the most beautiful woman I had ever seen, even as the illness took its toll. And I would do all of it again, 1,000 times over, without a single complaint, because she was my Eleanor, and there was nothing in this world I would not do for her. There is one night from those months that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. It was very late, and Eleanor could not sleep because of the pain, and neither could I, so I helped her out to the porch, wrapped in a blanket, and we sat together under the stars. She was so thin by then, so frail, but her mind was clear, and her eyes were still the same eyes I had fallen in love with at a church social nearly half a century before. And she said, "Harold, do you remember the night we moved in?" And I said, "Of course I do." We sat on the floor of the empty living room with a single lamp and a thermos of coffee, and she smiled and said, "We have had a good life in this house, haven't we?" And I said, "The best life." And she took my hand, her grip so light now, and she said, "When I am gone, I do not want you to be sad every time you look at these walls. I want you to remember that every single one of them holds something happy. That is what we built here, Harold. Not just a house, a lifetime of happy walls." Yeah, I have thought about that phrase every single day since. A lifetime of happy walls. And that is exactly why I could not, would not, let anyone take those walls from me. Now here is the part that matters for everything that came after. When Daniel found out his mother was sick, he came home. And for a little while, I let myself hope. I hoped that his mother's illness would wake something up in him, would remind him of who he was and where he came from. For a few visits, it almost seemed that way. He sat with her. He held her hand. He told her he loved her. But Sabrina came with him, and Sabrina was not interested in Eleanor's illness except for what it meant. I caught her, more than once, wandering through the house while Daniel sat with his mother, opening doors, looking in closets, standing in the master bedroom with a strange, evaluating look on her face. One afternoon, I came out of Eleanor's room to get her some water, and I found Sabrina in my study, standing at my desk, going through my papers. She did not even have the decency to look ashamed. She just smiled that smooth glass smile and said she was looking for a pen. But I knew what she was looking for. She was looking for the deed. She was looking for the will. She was looking for anything that would tell her who this house would belong to when the old people were gone. And it was not the first time either. A few weeks before, I had noticed that the papers in my desk had been disturbed, not quite where I had left them. I had told myself I was imagining it, but now, seeing her standing there, I understood. She had been searching my home, room by room, drawer by drawer, for weeks, while my wife lay dying down the hall, looking for the map to everything we owned. I did not make a scene. I have learned over a long life that the loudest person in the room is almost always the weakest. Real strength is quiet. Real strength watches and waits and remembers. So I simply handed her a pen from my pocket and said, "Here you go," and I watched her walk out of my study empty-handed. But that was the moment I understood exactly what was coming. That was the moment I knew that when Eleanor was gone, this woman, and God forgive him, perhaps my own son, would come for the house. And so, while my wife was still alive, while I still had the strength and the clarity to do it, I made a decision. I decided to protect what Eleanor and I had built, quietly, carefully, in a way that no one would see coming. There was a man in town named Arthur Reese. Arthur was a lawyer, about my age, and I had known him for nearly 40 years. I had built the addition on his house back in the 80s. He had drawn up the paperwork when Eleanor and I bought our land. He was not one of those slick city lawyers in a glass tower. He was a small-town attorney who kept his office above the hardware store and knew every family in the county by name. And more than that, he was my friend. So one afternoon, while a neighbor sat with Eleanor, I drove into town and I climbed the stairs to Arthur's office, and I told him everything. I told him about Sabrina going through my desk. I told him about the way she looked at the house. I told him about my fear that when Eleanor was gone, they would find a way to take the home I had built with my own hands. Arthur listened, the way old friends listen, without interrupting. And when I was done, he took off his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and said, "Harold, let me ask you something. Whose name is on the deed to that house right now?" And I said, "Mine and Eleanor's, of course. We bought the land together. I built it together with her." Arthur nodded slowly and said, Then here is what we are going to do. And over the next several weeks, quietly, without telling Daniel or Sabrina or anyone else, Arthur and I put a plan in place. I am not going to tell you every detail of it yet, because the details are what made all the difference later, and I want you to understand them at the moment they mattered. But I will tell you this, when we were finished, that house was protected in a way that Sabrina, for all her scheming, would never expect. The deed, the ownership, the legal reality of who that house truly belonged to was locked down as tight as Arthur could make it. And it was mine, not Daniel's, not Sabrina's. Mine, clearly and legally and permanently, in a way that no amount of scheming could undo. Arthur shook my hand when it was done and said, "Harold, they can change every lock in that house if they want to. It will not matter one bit. Because on paper, in the eyes of the law, that house is yours, and no one can take it from you." I did not fully appreciate, in that moment, how those exact words would come true. I drove home that day feeling lighter than I had in months. I had done what a man is supposed to do. I had protected my home, and I had protected the memory of everything Eleanor and I had built. Now, I could focus on what little time she had left. Eleanor lived another 4 months. They were hard months, and they were precious months, and I would not trade a single day of them. Near the end, when she was very weak, she asked me to bring her to the window so she could see her garden one last time. I carried her, light as a bird by then, and I held her at the window while she looked out at the roses she had planted decades ago, and she said, "Harold, promise me something." I said, "Anything." And she said, "Promise me you will not let them take our home. Promise me you will not let Daniel and that woman push you out of the house you built for us. I want you to grow old here. I want you to sit on that porch and remember me." And I held her, and I promised. I promised my dying wife that I would not let anyone take our home, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. Eleanor passed away 3 nights later, in our bed, in the house I built, with her hand in mine, and the moonlight coming through the window she loved. Her last words to me were, "Thank you for my beautiful life, Harold." And then she was gone. And I was alone, for the first time in 46 years, in a house full of a lifetime of memories, with a promise to keep, and a son and daughter-in-law who I already knew were coming for everything. The funeral was small, the way Eleanor would have wanted. The little church where we married was half full of the people whose lives she had touched. Neighbors she had brought soup to, women she had sewn dresses for. The pastor spoke about her kindness, and half the room was crying, because everyone who ever met Eleanor loved her. Daniel came, of course. He sat in the front row, and to his credit, he wept for his mother. Whatever else he had become, he had loved her once, and I think in that church, for 1 hour, he remembered it. Sabrina sat beside him in a black dress that probably cost more than the casket, and she dabbed at eyes that never actually produced any tears. She spent most of the service on her phone, held low in her lap, thinking no one could see. I saw. After the service, there was a small gathering at the house. People brought food, they shared stories about Eleanor, and once again, while grieving people filled my living room, I watched Sabrina move through my home like an appraiser at an estate sale. She opened the linen closet. She examined the built-in cabinets I had made by hand. She walked the upstairs hallway, opening the doors to each bedroom, and I saw her murmur something to Daniel, who nodded without really listening. That evening, after everyone had gone, Daniel and Sabrina stayed behind. And Sabrina, who had barely spoken 10 sincere words to me in all the years I had known her, suddenly became very interested in my well-being. "Dad," she said, and it was the first time she had ever called me Dad, "this house is so big for one person now. And these stairs, Dad, they are so dangerous for a man your age. Have you thought about what you are going to do?" I said I had not given it much thought, which was a lie, because I had thought about very little else. She glanced at Daniel, and then she said, "Well, we have been talking, and we think the best thing, the safest thing for you, would be to move somewhere smaller. Somewhere with no stairs, somewhere you would be looked after. And of course," she said, "we could take the house off your hands so you would not have to worry about the upkeep, or the taxes, or any of it." There it was, 4 hours after we buried Eleanor, and my daughter-in-law was already trying to take the house. I looked at my son, waiting for him to say something, to defend me. to tell his wife that this was not the time. But Daniel just looked at the floor. He said nothing. And in that silence, I understood that I had lost him, maybe a long time ago, and that whatever was coming, I would be facing it alone. I did not argue. I did not make a scene. I simply said, I appreciate your concern, but I am not ready to make any decisions right now. I just buried my wife. I would like some time. Sabrina's smile tightened, just slightly, the way it did when she did not get her way. But she said, "Of course, Dad. Take all the time you need," and they left. And I sat alone in the house I built, and I felt Eleanor's absence in every room, and I renewed my promise to her in the silence. I would not let them take our home. Over the next 2 weeks, Sabrina called constantly. She called to check on me, she said. But every call found its way, sooner or later, to the house. Had I thought more about downsizing, she had found some lovely senior apartments, she said. She could arrange everything. She even had a real estate agent ready to give me an estimate on the house, just so I would know what it was worth. No pressure. No pressure. Everything about it was pressure. I put her off, gently, again and again. I was not ready. I needed time. I was grieving. All of which was true, and all of which she clearly found deeply inconvenient. And then one morning, about 3 weeks after the funeral, I decided to do something I had been doing every few days since Eleanor passed. I decided to drive out to the cemetery and sit with my wife. It was a gray morning, the kind Eleanor used to love, when the light is soft and the whole world feels quiet and close. I made myself a cup of coffee, I put on my good coat, and I drove the 20 minutes out to the cemetery on the hill where we had laid her to rest. I brought fresh flowers from her own garden. Roses, the ones she had planted with her own hands, still blooming in the yard she loved even though she was gone. I sat down on the little folding stool I kept in the truck, and I set the flowers against her headstone, and I talked to her. I told her about my days. I told her how quiet the house was. I told her I was keeping my promise. I must have sat there for 2 hours. Grief has a way of stretching time, and I was in no hurry to go home to an empty house. Eventually, the wind picked up and the sky darkened, and I told Eleanor I would come back in a few days, and I kissed my fingers and pressed them to the cold stone of her name, and I drove home. And when I pulled into my driveway, something was wrong. There was a car I did not recognize parked in front of my house, a locksmith's van, and standing on my front porch, watching the man work on my front door, was Sabrina. I got out of my truck slowly. My heart was pounding, but my hands were steady. I walked up the path that I had laid with my own hands, past the garden Eleanor had planted, up to the porch of the house I had built board by board. And I said, "Sabrina, what is going on here?" She turned to me with that smooth glass smile, but there was something harder in it now, something triumphant. "Harold," she said, and she was not calling me Dad anymore. "Harold, we have decided it is time. This house is too much for you. We are having the locks changed for security reasons. It is for your own good." I looked past her at the locksmith, an uncomfortable young man who clearly wished he were anywhere else, fitting a brand new lock into my front door. I said, "This is my house." And Sabrina said, "Well, actually, that is a complicated question, isn't it? Daniel is your only child. This house is going to be his anyway. We are simply making the transition easier for everyone. We have arranged a lovely place for you. Your things are being packed." And I stood there on my own porch, locked out of the house I had built for the woman I loved, on the very day I had come home from visiting her grave, and I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. I felt a cold, clear, absolute calm. Because Sabrina had made one enormous mistake. She thought the house was Daniel's. She thought that because Eleanor was gone and I was old, the house would simply fall into her hands like ripe fruit. She had no idea what Arthur and I had done. She had no idea that every single thing she had just said was legally worthless. I did not tell her. Not yet. I have learned, over a long life, that the loudest person in the room is almost always the weakest. So I let her have her moment. I let her stand there on my porch, smug and certain, believing she had won. I simply said, "I see. And where exactly am I supposed to go tonight?" Sabrina, delighted that I was not fighting, said there was a motel in town where I could stay while things got sorted out. She actually handed me a small bag, already packed, with some of my clothes and my medications in it. She had thought of everything, except the one thing that mattered. I took the bag, I looked at my house one last time, at the lit windows, at the porch, at the maple tree with my son's initials still carved in it, and I got back in my truck, and I drove to the motel, and I did not say another word, because I already knew what was going to happen next. That night, in a cheap motel room that smelled of stale smoke, I did not cry, and I did not rage. I picked up the phone, and I called my friend Arthur Reese. It was late, but he answered, and when I told him what had happened, there was a long silence on the line. And then Arthur said, in a very quiet, very steady voice, "Harold, do not do anything, do not sign anything, do not agree to anything, go to sleep, and let me make some calls in the morning." "And Harold," he said, before he hung up, "they have made a very, very serious mistake. I barely slept that night. I lay on that thin motel mattress, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, and I let myself feel it all. The grief, the betrayal, the sheer, breathtaking cruelty of being locked out of my own home on the day I came back from my wife's grave. But underneath all of it, there was something else. There was Eleanor's voice, saying, 'Promise me you will not let them take our home.' And there was the memory of Arthur shaking my hand and saying, 'They can change every lock in that house if they want to. It will not matter one bit.' Morning came slowly. I made myself a cup of bitter motel coffee, and I waited by the phone. And at 9:15, it rang. I picked it up before the second ring. It was Arthur. And the first thing he said, in that steady, careful voice of his, was, 'Sir, you own the deed.' He said, 'Harold, I have spent the morning confirming every detail, and I want you to hear this clearly. That house is yours. Legally, completely, and beyond any question. Your name, and only your name, is on the deed. What Sabrina did yesterday, changing those locks, packing your things, putting you out, was not just cruel, it was illegal. She locked the rightful and sole legal owner out of his own home.' And Harold," he said, and I could hear something almost like a smile in his voice, "we are going to make that very clear to everyone involved." I sat down on the edge of that motel bed, and I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for 3 weeks. "Tell me what to do, Arthur," I said, and Arthur told me. He said, "First, do not go back to the house yet. Do not give them any chance to accuse you of causing a scene, of being aggressive, of anything. We are going to do this the right way, the legal way, the way that leaves them no room to wriggle." He said, "I am going to draft a letter today, an official letter, on my firm's letterhead. And that letter is going to inform your son and his wife, in plain legal language, of exactly what the situation is. That you are the sole owner of the property. That they have no legal claim to it whatsoever. That changing the locks and removing your belongings constitutes an illegal eviction and, frankly, unlawful entry and interference with your property. And that they have 72 hours to restore your access, return your belongings, and vacate the premises, or we will involve the authorities and pursue every legal remedy available." I asked him, "Will it really be that simple?" And Arthur said, "No, Harold. People like Sabrina do not give up easily. She is going to fight. She is going to look for loopholes. She is going to try to make this about your age, your competence, your grief. But she is standing on nothing. There is no loophole. There is no claim. There is only the deed, and the deed is yours. So it may take a little time, and it may get ugly, but Harold, there is only one way this ends. You are going home." I want to tell you about the days that followed, because this is where I learned exactly who my son was, and exactly what my daughter-in-law was willing to do. Arthur sent the letter that same afternoon, by certified mail and by courier, so there could be no claim that it was never received. And Sabrina's response told me everything. She did not call Daniel's father to apologize. She did not restore my access. Instead, within a day, she hired a lawyer of her own. A city lawyer, expensive and aggressive, the kind who sends threatening letters for a living. And that lawyer sent Arthur a letter claiming that I was, and I quote, "an elderly man of diminishing capacity who was no longer able to care for himself or manage his own affairs, and that my family was acting in my best interest by relocating me to appropriate care." They were not trying to argue that the house was theirs anymore. They knew they could not win that, So instead, they were going to try to argue that I was not competent to own it. They were going to try to have me declared incompetent, so they could take control of my affairs, and then take the house anyway. When Arthur told me this, I felt a fury unlike anything I had ever known. Not because I was afraid it would work, Arthur assured me it would not, but because my own son was sitting by, silent, while his wife tried to have me, his own father, declared mentally unfit, so they could steal the house his mother had died in. Arthur told me not to worry, and he had a plan for this too. He said, "Harold, they want to claim you are not competent. Fine. Then we will prove, beyond any doubt, that you are one of the most competent men in this county." And he arranged for me to be evaluated by a doctor, a proper geriatric specialist, the very next week. I sat with that doctor for 2 hours. She asked me questions, tested my memory, my reasoning, my judgment. She asked me about my finances, my daily life, my decisions. And at the end of it, she wrote a report stating, in clear medical language, that I was fully competent, sharp, capable, and entirely able to manage my own affairs. She wrote that she saw no evidence whatsoever of cognitive decline. She wrote, in fact, that I was more clear-headed than many people half my age. Arthur added that report to our file, and he said, "Let them try to claim you are incompetent now. We have a specialist's report that says otherwise. This card they are playing is dead before they even lay it down." But Sabrina was not finished. When the competency angle collapsed, she tried something else. She and her lawyer began to argue that Daniel had, over the years, made significant financial contributions to the upkeep of the house, and that he was therefore entitled to a share of it. This was a lie. Daniel had never contributed a penny to that house. In fact, over the years, it had been Eleanor and I who gave money to him, the loans that were never repaid, the help with his wedding, the money Eleanor raised by selling her own mother's jewelry to pay for his final year of college, a fact he still did not even know. And here is where a lifetime of quiet habits saved me. Because I am a builder, and builders keep records. I had kept every receipt, every bank statement, every canceled check, going back 40 years, all of it neatly filed in the study Sabrina had once searched for the deed. I had proof of every dollar that had ever gone into that house, and every dollar had come from me and Eleanor. And I had proof, in Eleanor's own careful handwriting, of the money we had given Daniel over the years. Arthur compiled all of it, and when Sabrina's lawyer claimed that Daniel had contributed to the house, Arthur sent back a folder 2 inches thick, documenting the truth. Not $1 from Daniel, tens of thousands of dollars from us, to him. The claim evaporated overnight. Every move Sabrina made, Arthur was ready for. Every lie, we had the truth on paper. Every angle she tried, it collapsed under the simple, unshakable weight of the facts. Because that is the thing about people like Sabrina. They are so used to winning through pressure, through intimidation, through sheer audacity, that they never stop to consider that the quiet old man they are bullying might have spent his whole life building things that last, including a paper trail. While all of this was happening, while the letters flew back and forth and Sabrina's schemes crumbled one after another, I was still living in that motel room. Arthur had advised me to stay put until it was fully resolved, so that no one could accuse me of forcing my way back in. It was a lonely time. I would sit in that little room in the evenings and think about Eleanor, and about the house, and about how strange it was that a man could build a home with his own hands and then be locked out of it in his old age by his own family. There were moments, in that motel room, when I nearly gave up. I am not too proud to admit that. There were nights when I lay awake and thought, maybe I am too old for this fight. Maybe I should just take their motel and their tiny apartment and let them have the house and spend whatever years I have left not fighting anyone. It would have been easier. But then I would remember Eleanor at the window, looking out at her roses, saying, "Promise me you will not let them take our home." And I would remember that a promise to the woman you loved for 46 years is not the kind of thing a man breaks because he is tired. So every morning, I got up. I made my bad coffee. I put on a clean shirt. And I faced another day of the fight, because that is what you do. You keep your promises, even when it would be easier not to, especially when it would be easier not to. But I was not entirely alone, because there was one person in that family who had not forgotten who I was. My granddaughter, Grace. Grace was Daniel and Sabrina's only child, 20 years old, in her third year of college, studying to be a social worker. And Grace was nothing like her mother. Where Sabrina was cold and calculating, Grace was warm and open. Where Sabrina saw people as obstacles or opportunities, Grace saw them as people. I do not know how Sabrina and Daniel raised a daughter like Grace. Sometimes a good soul just grows where you least expect it. Grace had loved her grandmother dearly. When Eleanor was sick, it was Grace, not her parents, who came to visit most often. She would drive down from her college on weekends and sit with Eleanor and read to her and paint her nails and listen to her stories. Eleanor adored her. She used to say that Grace had an old soul, that she was the one bright spot in a family that had lost its way. And when Grace found out what her mother had done, when she learned that Sabrina had locked her grandfather out of his own home on the day he came back from the cemetery, she was horrified. She called me at the motel. I still do not know how she got the number. And when I heard her voice, this sweet girl crying on the phone, saying, "Grandpa, I am so sorry, I did not know, I would never have let them do this. I nearly broke down myself." She said, "Grandpa, this is wrong. What they are doing is so wrong, and I told my mother that, and she told me to stay out of it. But I cannot stay out of it. Grandma would never have wanted this." And I told Grace the truth. I told her not to worry. I told her that everything was going to be all right, that I had protected the house long ago, that the law was on my side, and that I would be home before she knew it. And I told her something else. I told her that no matter what happened with her parents, she would always have a place in that house, because she was Eleanor's granddaughter, and Eleanor's love for her did not end when Eleanor died. Grace started coming to visit me at the motel. She brought me real coffee and home-cooked food, and, more than anything, she brought me hope. We would sit and talk for hours, about her grandmother, about her studies, about her dreams. And slowly, I began to realize that even in the middle of this ugliness, something good was growing. I was getting to know my granddaughter, really know her, in a way I never had before, and I began to understand that maybe, just maybe, the future of this family was not in my son, who had lost his way, but in his daughter, who had somehow found hers. Grace also told me things about what was happening inside her parents' house. She told me that her father, Daniel, was not sleeping, that he paced the floor at night, that he and Sabrina were fighting, more and more, behind closed doors. Because, Grace said, part of Daniel knew. Part of him knew that what they were doing was monstrous. But part of him remembered the father who taught him to swing a hammer, the father who worked double shifts to send him to college, the mother who sold her own jewelry so he could finish school. Daniel was drowning in guilt, Grace said, even as Sabrina pushed him to keep fighting. And I felt something I did not expect to feel. I felt sorry for my son, because a man who does a terrible thing and feels nothing is a monster. But a man who does a terrible thing while his conscience screams at him to stop, and does it anyway, out of weakness, out of fear of his wife, out of shame, that man is not a monster. That man is just lost. And a lost man can sometimes still find his way home. During those weeks in the motel, I kept visiting Eleanor's grave. Arthur had told me not to go near the house, but he never said anything about the cemetery, and I needed her more than ever. I would drive out to that hill every few days and sit on my little folding stool and tell her everything. I told her about the locks. I told her about Arthur and the deed. I told her about the terrible things Sabrina was trying and about our son standing silent through all of it. And I told her about Grace and how our granddaughter had turned out to be the bravest, kindest soul in the whole family. One afternoon, sitting there in the gray light, I said out loud, "Eleanor, I do not know if I am strong enough for this, and I am not a superstitious man, but I swear to you, at that exact moment, the wind moved through the trees on that hill, soft and warm, out of season, and I felt something settle over me like a hand on my shoulder." And I knew what she would have said. She would have said, "Harold, you built a whole house with these hands. You can hold on to it with them too." So I did. I dried my eyes, and I drove back to the motel, and I kept fighting, because she was still with me, in every happy wall of that house, and I was not going to let her down. The 72 hours in Arthur's first letter came and went, and Sabrina did not comply. So Arthur escalated, exactly as he said he would. He filed a formal complaint. He contacted the local authorities and explained the situation, providing the deed, the competency report, and the documentation of the illegal lockout. And this is where Sabrina's confidence finally began to crack. Because it is one thing to bully a grieving old man in private, it is another thing entirely when the county sheriff's office is involved and a lawyer is documenting your every move, and the deed to the house has your father-in-law's name on it and no one else's. Arthur arranged a meeting, all of us, together, in his office above the hardware store. Me, Arthur, Daniel, Sabrina, and Sabrina's expensive city lawyer. Grace asked if she could come too, and I said yes, because she was part of this family, and because I think I wanted her there to see that the truth wins in the end. I will never forget that meeting. I arrived early with Arthur. I wore my good suit, the same one I had worn to Eleanor's funeral, and when Daniel and Sabrina walked in, I saw the change in them immediately. Daniel would not meet my eyes. He looked exhausted, gray, hollowed out. Sabrina, on the other hand, walked in like she owned the place, her lawyer beside her in a suit that probably cost $1,000, and she gave me a cold little nod as if we were opponents in a business deal rather than family torn apart by her greed. We sat down at Arthur's long table, and Sabrina's lawyer started first, the way those men always do, trying to seize control of the room. He began to talk about my age, about my recent loss, about the family's legitimate concerns for my welfare, about how everyone just wanted what was best for me. He talked for several minutes, smooth and practiced. And Arthur let him talk, the way a patient man lets a loud man exhaust himself. And when the lawyer finally finished, Arthur opened a folder, slid a single piece of paper across the table, and said, "This is the deed to the property. Please read the name on it." The lawyer looked at it. He was quiet for a moment. And then Arthur slid another paper across. "This is a report from a geriatric specialist, dated last week, confirming that my client is fully competent and capable of managing his own affairs. Please read the conclusion." The lawyer read it, and then Arthur slid a third folder across, a thick one. "And this," Arthur said, "is complete documentation of every financial contribution ever made to that property, going back 40 years. You will find that every dollar came from my client and his late wife. You will also find records of substantial sums of money given by my client to his son over the years, including loans that were never repaid. Please, take your time." The room was very quiet. Sabrina's lawyer set down the papers, leaned over, and whispered something in her ear. And I watched Sabrina's face, for the first time in all the years I had known her, lose its composure completely. But she was not a woman who surrendered easily. She leaned forward and she tried one more time. She said, "This is absurd. He is manipulating everyone. He turned my own daughter against me. He has probably manipulated that doctor too. An old man like this, alone, grieving, he cannot possibly be thinking clearly, no matter what some report says." And Arthur, calm as ever, said, "Mrs. Whitaker, you are welcome to believe whatever you like. But belief is not evidence. And in this room, we deal in evidence. The deed is evidence. The medical report is evidence. 40 years of financial records are evidence. What, exactly, do you have?" Sabrina opened her mouth and closed it again, because she had nothing. She had always operated on pressure and confidence, and the assumption that people would fold before her. She had never, in her whole life, run into a wall of simple, patient, documented truth. And she did not know what to do. Her lawyer tried to regain control, tried to steer things back toward a settlement, but the ground had shifted, and everyone in that room could feel it. Sabrina's lawyer straightened up, cleared his throat, and did the thing that lawyers do when they know they have lost. He began to talk about a settlement. Perhaps, he said, there was a way to resolve this amicably. Perhaps my client would be willing to consider some arrangement, some compensation, in exchange for a quiet resolution. And that was when I finally spoke. I had sat quietly through the whole thing, letting Arthur handle it, letting the papers speak for themselves. But now I raised my hand, and Arthur stopped, and the room turned to me. I looked at Sabrina, I looked at my son, who still would not meet my eyes, and I said, "I do not want your settlement. I do not want your money. I want you to understand something." I said, "That house was not just a building. My wife and I built it with our own hands. I laid the foundation myself. I framed every wall. Eleanor planted the garden and painted the walls and made it a home. We raised our son in that house. That maple tree in the backyard has his initials carved in it from when he was 9 years old. Eleanor died in that house, in our bed, with the moonlight coming through the window she loved. And on the very day I came home from sitting at her grave, you locked me out of it. I turned to Sabrina. You went through my desk while my wife was dying. You measured my home like a piece of merchandise. And when she was gone, you did not even wait for the flowers on her grave to wilt before you tried to take everything. Sabrina opened her mouth to speak, but I was not finished. And then, I said, when you could not simply take the house, you tried to have me declared insane. You tried to convince a court that I, a man who built his own home with his own hands and kept every receipt for 40 years, was too feeble to manage my own life. You tried to erase me. The room was silent. Grace was crying quietly. And then I turned to my son. Daniel, I said, and he finally looked up at me. Daniel, I said, your mother sold her own mother's jewelry to pay for your last year of college. He went very still. You never knew that, I said. She made me promise never to tell you, because she did not want you to feel guilty. She wanted you to have your chance. That is how much your mother loved you. And this is how you honored her memory. By standing silent in the corner while your wife locked your father out of the house your mother died in. Daniel's face crumpled. And for the first time since he was a small boy, I watched my son break down completely. Right there at that table, in front of everyone. He put his face in his hands and he wept, and he said over and over, I am so sorry, Dad. I am so sorry. I am so sorry. What happened next surprised everyone in that room, including me. Daniel stood up, he wiped his face, and he turned, not to me, but to his wife. And he said, Sabrina, it is over. She stared at him. What are you talking about? She said. And Daniel said, I mean it is over, all of it. This scheme, this lawsuit, and I think, God help me, maybe us. I have been lying awake every night for weeks, because I knew that what we were doing was wrong, and I did it anyway, because I was a coward. Because I let you convince me that we deserved that house, that my father was in the way, that this was somehow acceptable. But it is not acceptable. It is the worst thing I have ever done in my life. That is my father. He built that house. My mother died in it. And we locked him out of it like he was nothing. Sabrina's face went white with fury. She started to say that he was being ridiculous, that they had come too far, that they could still win. But Daniel just shook his head. No, he said, we cannot win, and even if we could, I do not want to. I would rather lose everything than be the man who did this to his own father. He turned to Arthur and said, we withdraw everything. The lawsuit, the competency claim, all of it. Whatever paperwork needs to be signed to end this, I will sign it right now. And then he turned to me. And he said, Dad, I do not expect you to forgive me. I do not deserve it. But I am so sorry. For all of it. For the years I was ashamed of you. For letting them treat you and Mom like you did not matter. For this. You gave me everything, and I gave you this. And I will regret it for the rest of my life. I looked at my son, this broken man standing in front of me, and I felt 46 years of Eleanor's love welling up inside me, because she had always believed he would find his way back, and she had been right. She was always right about people. I stood up, I walked around that table, and I put my arms around my son, and I held him the way I held him the day I carried him through the front door of that house as a newborn. And I said, I forgive you, Daniel. I forgive you. Sabrina stormed out. Her lawyer gathered his papers and followed her. And that was, more or less, the end of Sabrina. The legal case ended almost immediately after that meeting. There was nothing left to fight. Daniel withdrew every claim, signed everything Arthur put in front of him, and instructed Sabrina's lawyer that he would no longer be paying for any of it. Within a week, I had my house back. I will never forget the day I walked back through my own front door. Grace drove me there. Daniel met us at the house, and he had already had the locks changed back, and he handed me a new set of keys, and his hand was shaking as he did it. I put my key in the lock of the door I had hung with my own hands nearly 40 years earlier, and I turned it, and I walked inside. And the house was exactly as I had left it. My belongings, which Sabrina had begun to pack, were still in their boxes in the living room, and Daniel and Grace spent the whole afternoon helping me unpack them, putting everything back exactly where it belonged. Eleanor's photographs back on the mantel, her china back in the cabinet I had built for it, her sweater still hanging on the hook by the back door, where I had left it, where I would leave it for a long time yet, because I was not ready to move it and I did not have to explain that to anyone. That evening, after Grace had gone home, Daniel stayed. And he and I sat on the front porch, in the two chairs where Eleanor and I used to sit, and we watched the sun go down behind the maple tree with his initials carved in it. And we talked, really talked, for the first time in 20 years. He asked me about the deed. He said, "Dad, how did you know? How did you protect the house so completely? Sabrina was so sure it would just come to me." And before I answered, he said something else, quietly. He said, "Dad, can I ask you something, and you can tell me the truth? When did you stop trusting me?" And I thought about that for a long moment, because he deserved an honest answer. And I said, "Daniel, I never stopped loving you, not for one single day. But I stopped trusting you the day I found your wife going through my desk while your mother was dying, and I watched you say nothing. That was the day I understood that if I did not protect this house, no one would." He nodded slowly, and his eyes filled up, and he said, "I deserve that." And I said, "Maybe. But here is what I want you to understand. Love and trust are not the same thing. Love, you never have to earn. You had my love the moment you were born, and you will have it until the day I die. But trust is different. Trust is built, like a house, one board at a time, and it can be torn down in an afternoon. You tore ours down. But the good news, son, is that anything that can be torn down can also be rebuilt, and we have time." And I saw something ease in him when I said that, some weight he had been carrying, and he wiped his eyes and said, "Then I am going to rebuild it, Dad, board by board, for the rest of your life." And I told him the truth. I told him about the day I found Sabrina going through my desk while his mother was dying. I told him how I had known, in that moment, exactly what was coming. And I told him about Arthur, and about the quiet work we had done to make sure the house could never be taken. Because here is what I had done, all those months ago, that Sabrina never suspected. It was not just that my name was on the deed. Arthur and I had gone a step further. We had placed the house into a legal trust, an arrangement designed so that the home could never be sold, seized, borrowed against, or taken from me during my lifetime, no matter what anyone claimed about my age or my competence. And the trust named a successor. It named the one person Eleanor and I trusted to protect that house after I was gone. Not Daniel. I had made that decision back when I did not know if I could trust him at all. The trust named Grace, our granddaughter. The girl who sat with her grandmother when she was dying. The girl who cried on the phone when she learned what her mother had done. The girl who brought me coffee in a lonely motel room and reminded me that goodness can grow in the most unlikely places. When I told Daniel this, he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "That is exactly right, Dad. Grace should have it. She is the best of all of us." And I heard, in his voice, that there was no jealousy in it, no resentment, only agreement. And I understood that my son really had come back. I want to tell you what happened to everyone, because I think you have earned the whole story. Sabrina and Daniel divorced within the year. It was not only because of what happened with the house, though that was the breaking point. Daniel told me later that the whole ordeal had forced him to see his wife clearly for the first time, to see the coldness in her, the calculation, the way she treated people as things to be used. He said that once he saw it, he could not unsee it. The divorce was not pleasant, but it was final. Sabrina moved to another city. She got the settlement she was legally entitled to from the marriage, which was considerable, because Daniel was generous even in that, but she never got a single nail of my house. And, I am told, she never speaks of the father-in-law who quietly outmaneuvered her at every turn. I do not wish her ill. I truly do not. I have lived too long and lost too much to carry that kind of weight. But I do hope that somewhere, someday, she learns that the things that matter most in life are not the ones you can seize. They are the ones you build and the ones you are given freely, out of love. Daniel changed after that. Not overnight. Real change is never overnight. But steadily, genuinely, He became more like the boy who used to follow me around the workshop, asking what every tool was for. He started visiting every week. Not out of guilt, though maybe it began that way, but because he wanted to. He would come on Sundays, and we would work on projects around the house together, fixing the things that a house nearly 40 years old always needs fixing. I taught him things I had meant to teach him decades ago. How to reset a sticking door. How to replace a rotted porch board. How to do the small, patient work of keeping a home standing. And in those quiet Sunday afternoons, with sawdust in the air and my son beside me, I got back something I thought I had lost forever. I got back my boy. Grace graduated from college the following spring. I went to her graduation. I sat in the audience, in my good suit, next to Daniel, and when they called her name and she walked across that stage, I stood up and clapped until my hands hurt. This old carpenter, making a fool of himself for the granddaughter who had stood by him when it counted. Afterward, she found me in the crowd, still in her cap and gown, and she threw her arms around me and said, "Grandpa, I am so glad you are here." And I said, "Sweetheart, there is nowhere else I would ever be." She became a social worker, spending her days helping vulnerable people, many of them elderly, many of them people who had been mistreated or forgotten or taken advantage of by the very families who should have protected them. She said, more than once, that what happened to me was part of why she chose that path, that she wanted to be, for other people, the person who stands up when no one else will. Eleanor would have been so proud of her. Eleanor is proud of her. I have to believe that, wherever she is. Grace comes to the house often. She has her own key now. Sometimes she brings friends, and the house fills up with young voices and laughter. And I sit in my chair by the window and I can almost feel Eleanor there beside me, smiling at the life that still fills the rooms she loved. One day, that house will be Grace's. The house I built with my own hands. The house Eleanor and I dreamed about in a rented room above a laundromat. The house where we raised our son, and where my wife took her last breath. It will belong to the one person who never wanted it, never schemed for it, never saw it as anything but the home where her grandmother loved her. And that is exactly why she deserves it. It has been a little over a year now since all of this happened. I am still in the house. I still sleep in the bed where Eleanor took her last breath. And I still keep her sweater on the hook by the back door. And I still tend the roses she planted, though I am not half the gardener she was. The maple tree with Daniel's initials is still standing in the backyard, a little bigger every year. And life, I am surprised to say, is good. It is not the life I planned. I planned to grow old with Eleanor in this house, the two of us together until the end. That is not the life I got. But the life I got has its own quiet blessings, and I have learned, at 71, that a man should be grateful for the blessings he receives, even when they come dressed as hardships. Because if Sabrina had never tried to take the house, I might never have truly known my granddaughter. If my son had never fallen so far, I might never have seen him climb back, and I might never have gotten back the boy I thought I had lost. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you cracks your life open just enough to let the light back in. Daniel still comes every Sunday. Just last week, we spent the whole afternoon rebuilding the railing on the front porch, the one Eleanor and I used to lean on to watch the sunset. And as we worked, sawdust in the air, the sun going down behind the maple tree, Daniel stopped, and he looked at me, and he said, "Dad, I almost lost all of this. I almost lost you, and I do not know why you forgave me." And I set down my hammer, and I said, "Daniel, your mother believed in you, right up until the end. She always said you would find your way back. Forgiving you was not hard. It was just keeping a promise to her." He got quiet after that, and we went back to work, and neither of us said anything for a while. But it was a good silence, the kind that says more than words. I want to tell you what I have learned, in case it is of any use to you. I have learned that the loudest people are almost always the weakest. Sabrina was loud, she was aggressive and confident, and certain and pushy. And she filled every room she entered with her demands and her schemes. And she lost, completely, to a quiet old carpenter who never once raised his voice. Because real strength does not shout. Real strength does not need to. Real strength builds carefully, plans quietly, keeps its records, and waits. And when the moment comes, real strength does not have to fight, because it has already won, long before the loud people ever realized there was a battle. I have learned that the things you build with love cannot truly be stolen. They can be schemed for, they can be locked up, they can be fought over in lawyers' offices. But a house built by loving hands, a family bound by real love, a life of quiet decency, these things have roots too deep for greedy people to pull up. Sabrina thought she could take my house by changing the locks. She never understood that the house was never really about the locks, or the deed, or even the walls. It was about everything those walls held, and that was never hers to take. And I have learned, most of all, that it is never too late. It is never too late for a lost son to find his way home. It is never too late for an old man to discover a new reason to be grateful. It is never too late for love, the real kind, the patient kind, the kind Eleanor gave me for 46 years, to have the final word. So if you are out there, and someone is trying to take what you built, someone who thinks that because you are old, or tired, or grieving, you are an easy target, I want you to remember Harold Whittaker and his House of Happy Walls. Do not shout, do not panic, do not let them rush you into anything. Be quiet, be patient, keep your records, call your friends, and trust that the truth, laid down plainly on a table, is stronger than all the loud voices in the world. The people who love you built something in you that no one can ever change the locks on. Hold on to it. It is yours, and no one can take it. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. If it moved you, if any part of it reminded you of your own life, or someone you love, let me know in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from, and tell me one thing that someone you loved once built or gave to you that no one could ever take away. I read every single message, and they mean more to me than you know. And if you believe, like I do, that quiet dignity will always outlast loud greed, then subscribe and stay with me, because I have many more stories to tell. Take care of yourself, and take care of the things you build. This story is a work of fiction, created for dramatic entertainment. All characters, names, events, and circumstances are fictional, and any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. Nothing in this video is legal advice.